As a chief officer, I'm going to suggest to you that loving is a foundational principle that's going to serve you really well. And I'm not talking about romantic loving, although hopefully you have loving going on in that too. What I'm talking about really is loving as the essential characteristic of who you are. And in my work with leaders, what we're really doing much of the time is we're getting to better understand who you are. And we're doing that in order to expand your capacity and increase your impact. And I talk about this a lot, this idea that there is an essential self that I refer to as the who I am, that is the greater reality of who you are, and it's entirely positive in nature. And when you really get into that, and when I think anyone gets into this, certainly it's my experience, that when anyone starts to really get in contact with what that is for them, they end up talking about something that is loving. It's a loving experience, it's a loving expression, it's a loving being, it's a loving doing. And that's not to say that it's not also powerful. And as a chief officer, of course, you're being called upon to assert your power much of the time. You're in very demanding environments, you're in very competitive environments, you're in very challenging circumstances a lot of the time, and you're being called upon to assert your power. But I think often that assertion of power can come from what I refer to as a misidentification of what that is. Because another quite universal human experience is that probably in our early life, we may have had experiences where we, say, doubted that greater reality, where we might have experienced ourselves as not being powerful, as, say, being powerless. And so I represent that as a kind of additional layer of identity of how we relate to ourselves, which we could express as self-doubt. I doubt that I'm powerful. And then the very natural human response to that is to then, because it's useful to be powerful in this world, isn't it? The natural human response is to then assert power in some way, to really seek to prove to ourselves and to others and maybe to the world that we are in fact powerful. So we could call that a proving self. And we're attempting to prove that trait of power that we're doubting is inherently within who we are. And now here's the interesting thing, is that proving energy, that proving power, it may have served you really well. It may have been very effective in many ways as you've gone through your life. And in some ways you may go, yeah, that's been part of what got me to where I am now. But I think it's really important to understand where that assertion of power is coming from. Is it coming from that demand to prove to yourself, to others, to the world, that you are in fact powerful? Or is it coming from here, the inherent experience of self as being powerful, a securely located sense of self as I am powerful, as a natural expression of who I am? And it's important to understand the difference, because I'm going to suggest to you that the assertion of power from this place is in fact the more effective place from which to operate. When you assert power from that loving self, you will tend to be more effective. You'll tend to make smarter moves. You'll tend to naturally bring people with you as you assert that power. You'll tend toward being constructive rather than destructive. And you'll also tend to skew towards the win-win-wins, which tend to be more sustainable in the long run. So what I'm going to encourage you to really ask yourself is, where is my power, my assertion of power coming from? And to have the conviction of that loving self as the most effective place from which to assert your power. Because not only is it the most powerful place from which to assert your power, it's also the most effective, the most practical, and indeed the most enjoyable place from which to assert your power, from which to, in fact, lead.